Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
This is Bloomberg Businessweek. Insight from the reporters and editors that bring you America's most trusted business magazine. Plus, global business, finance, and tech news. The Bloomberg Businessweek podcast with Carol Massar and Tim Stenovec on Bloomberg Radio.
The U.S. imposing 10% tariffs on China. China retaliated with tariffs on $14 billion worth of American products, as well as some other measures. It was what many have been said is a calculated response. We wanted to look at this latest development when it comes to possible trade or actual trade wars, the back and forth, the geopolitics perhaps at play, Tim, and also what is the current economic relationship between the U.S. and China? Which economy may have more to lose? We want to kind of tie it all together to kind of understand this very important relationship and one that's been important for many years.
Okay, so we're going to talk about the actual back and forth on tariffs between the two. To talk about what we've seen, what it means, we welcome in Leland Miller, CEO of China Beige Book International. It's a private in-country data collection network developed to track the Chinese marketplace. Leland, also a member of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, also the Council of Foreign Relations, and a non-resident senior fellow at the Brant Scowcraft Center on International Security at the Atlantic Council. Also with us, Bloomberg News global economy reporter Enda Curran, who's in our Washington, D.C. bureau. Leland joining us from D.C. as well. Leland, you dig into the Chinese economy. That's what you do. You try to tell an accurate and a current picture. What do we need to understand about the Chinese economy today?
Well, markets are usually bipolar on China's economy. They either think things are going so terribly, it's on the verge of collapse, disaster waits, or they're really optimistic that we're right around the corner from big stimulus, things are getting better. It's usually one or the other. We're in neither of those positions and haven't been for a while. The economy's weak. Some of our latest data have actually been better, and not just better, but also better than official data. So what we're seeing is an economy that's not doing terribly well and is certainly under pressure, and will be under a lot of pressure if there are tariffs put on the economy later, because manufacturing has been the growth driver for a number of years now, but not in such a weak position that she has to come to the table groveling. So you're sort of in the middle right now, a weak economy, but one that's still standing up okay.
All right, so maybe Xi is not groveling. And I want to bring you in. You watch the global economy for us here at Bloomberg. We talked to you a lot about it, but also in particular the China-U.S. relationship. Do you see Xi in an okay position to negotiate with President Trump? I mean, does one of them have the upper hand? I guess I'm asking in your view.
The Chinese economy is in a weak spot at the moment, whereas the US economy is going relatively well. And of course, China cannot match the US dollar for dollar on putting tariffs on goods, because China doesn't buy as much stuff from the US that the US buys from China. So there's a big imbalance, if you want to talk about tariff tennis. There's a big imbalance in that game to begin with. But these things are never binary. It's not just as simple as making the point that the US has the upper hand. They do have a strong advantage when it comes to, as I say, tariffs. But China can retaliate in ways that it wants to. We saw those measures announced overnight, putting companies on an entity list, for example, putting some export restrictions on some of those critical minerals like tungsten, putting tariffs on goods where they can, like the farming machinery that China buys off the US. So there are ways they can respond, as I say, not dollar for dollar, but there are ways they can retaliate against the US.
Leland, how would you describe how interconnected the Chinese and U.S. economies are right now? We went through this during the first Trump presidency, and then during COVID, there was a lot of concern about, okay, well, we don't have access to PPE because it's all made in China, and there's a huge supply shortage of that. And there was a lot of conversation about decreasing our reliance for certain things on countries such as China. But lay it out for us today. How interconnected are the U.S. and China?
Well, it's a multi-layered story. I mean, on the one hand, there's enormous bilateral trade between the two. It's mostly the U.S. buying Chinese goods, not the other way around, but there's plenty of both. On the other hand, you have certain things that China controls the supply chains for, whether it's PPE, whether it's pharmaceuticals, whether it's with certain critical minerals. So on the one hand, you have a lot of trade. The other hand, China has leverage over certain supply chains going in the United States. On the other hand, you're seeing some aspects of strategic decoupling, particularly in the tech sector, where the United States and China are both looking at the other and saying, we don't want to be as reliant on the other country as possible, so we're going to do everything we can to minimize those vulnerabilities. So really, you have multiple stories here about it. A lot of trade interdependence, but also some elements of decoupling that will continue into the future.
And what I do also wonder is President Trump has talked about wanting a more balanced trade overall. From an economics and growth perspective, is he right that we should want that? And is that even possible with the lopsided relationship that we have in trade between China and the United States? The U.S. obviously buying a lot more from China currently.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, it is in terms of the merchandise goods deficit, it's a pretty big hole there. China would need to buy a lot of US product to make up that gap. There was the original agreement, of course, focused mainly on agricultural goods. The new administration has said they're going to go back and look at just how China performed in that deal. But China can step forward to the table and buy goods to make up some of that gap. And they have said they're willing to do so, by the way. But that's only the merchandise goods deficit side of the story. I mean, the US-China tension goes way beyond that. It goes into the areas of strategic competition, who's going to be the technology leader of the world. It goes into concerns over human rights, be it Xinjiang, Hong Kong, of course you have Taiwan. There's a whole gambit of issues there when it comes to US-China relations. So there's a possibility both leaders, and they've said they're going to talk over at some point over the coming days, there could be some conversation around buying more goods, coming to some kind of a meeting of minds on the merchandise trade deficit. But that won't solve all of these other much more broader strategic sources of competition between the US and China.
One thing I want to ask you, and let me first follow up with you, is that, remind our audience what American consumers get as a result of the US-China trade relationship.
Look, China has been the world's factory base now for the past 4+ decades. It's been a cheaper source of labour. It's had less environmental standards, less regulations of the kind you've seen in the Western world. So the end product has been that China has been a source of cheaper goods, cheaper white goods, cheaper clothing, cheaper electronics, cheaper computers, all of that. And the US consumer has benefited from that. Not just the US, of course, the entire world has benefited from that. Now, we are, of course, now at a moment of reckoning, whereby you have President Trump making the point that a lot of those products and materials should be sourced and built at home anyway to drive investment and create jobs here. And we've seen as part of this process, we've seen these kind of middle connector economies emerge as kind of bridging points between China and the US. So Mexico, Vietnam and Poland and Morocco and others are kind of setting up manufacturing bases and selling into the US as well. So, writ large, the US consumer and global consumer has benefited from China's industrial base over the past few decades, cheaper goods. But as I say, we now seem to be at something of an inflection point.
And let's not forget that cheaper cost of goods means it's cheaper for companies to produce lots of different products, sell them. Margins are maybe improved as a result. Leland, come on in, though. So what does China get out of the relationship with the United States in terms of trade?
Well, China buys commodities. China buys advanced technology, although less than it did before. I think they'd want to buy a lot more of it if they could. But essentially, the real inequity of the relationship is the fact that domestic demand in China is weak, and the imports have been traditionally weak, and exports have been strong. So the reason that there are trade frictions here is that the imbalance in the relationship is bad and has gotten worse and worse over time. And now you've got a Chinese government plan, which is called New Quality Productive Forces, which is we're going to manufacture more, we're going to produce more, we're going to export more, particularly in advanced technology sectors. So you're really taking political friction that already existed over trade, and you're saying not only are we not going to address them, we're going to double down and triple down the years ahead. So you have a real problem in terms of the structural trade balances of the two countries and where it's going next.
Leland, I'm wondering about, given that Xi was ruling during the first Trump administration and experienced this trade war the first time, how you view what we know about how he's responded since, given that there is a history here. Like, what did he learn in the first Trump administration?
Well, I think that they find President Trump less shocking than they did before, but I think markets have gotten ahead of themselves. We are not in a trade war with China, at least not yet. What's going on right now is part of a sequential rollout of the president's priorities in the very early days of the term. So Mexico and Canada were big targets because of fentanyl 1A and illegal immigration 1B. What's happening right now is a derivative of that. It's the fact that China sends a lot of the fentanyl precursors through Mexico in the United States. They're a big problem in terms of fentanyl getting into the United States ultimately. So the president threatened and then has apparently going forward with a 10% tariff on China for that. That is very different than what we may see later in the year based on a broader trade war that has to do with the economic imbalances I was talking about before. The fact that the trade deficit is so high for the United States bilaterally, multilaterally, of course, too. But, there are inequities in the trading relationship. There are economic restructuring issues that people in the administration care very much about. We're not there yet. We're at the very baby steps where we're still addressing the fentanyl issue. And that's why, baby stepping into the trade war, but this is not a trade war yet.
Another thing that complicates matters is Taiwan and the U.S. reliance on chips and other high tech that comes from Taiwan. It's a little different now than it was during the first Trump administration, but when you meld geopolitics and economics here, how does the equation change?
Yeah, well, obviously, the US has been attempting to de-risk in various supply chains, and certainly semiconductors is one of them. We've seen that big investment push by the previous administration, for example. So it's not quite as hot a topic as it was, but nonetheless, though, there's still a reliance there, obviously. But the real crux here is that President Xi has made explicitly clear consistently, and perhaps even more so over the past year, that when in terms of his three red lines, or his red lines, one of them is certainly Taiwan and what they consider to be internal interference, and that's where the rubber will hit the road in the US and China relationship. How President Trump navigates that, how he comes to terms with President Xi, accommodates him or not on his claim over Taiwan, that's certainly going to be one of the thorniest topics in all of this, and goes well above some of the issues I was speaking about earlier.
And what's at stake if this relationship breaks down? I mean, it's already been a tense one for a while. If you think about the tech war that's been underway and so on and so forth, it's not like this just happened overnight. Go back to certainly the first Trump administration. Even before that, it's been a very complicated and increasingly complicated relationship. What happens if the relationship, geopolitical as well as economic-wise, breaks down between the U.S. and China?
Well, it is very complicated. They are both intertwined. I mean, if you want to talk about just the economic side of it, if they were to say go down the road of further decoupling, the language now uses more about de-risking, but if it was to go down the road of decoupling, well, that's just going to be very expensive for businesses. They're going to have to relocate supply chains, relocate sources of manufacturing, shuffle production around the world, maybe shuffle production back to the US. So there's all kinds of complications, expense, delays, and the like involved in that. Then you get into the people exchanges, whether it's at student and university level or tourism level, that would be another area impacted. And of course, if you go beyond that and you get into a deterioration or collapse of relations between both governments, well, then that obviously speaks to a very difficult position for the world globally, geopolitically, at a time when there already are significant tensions. But I think the first step on that ladder would be a lot of disruption for the world economy.
Yeah, let's not forget, too, we've seen China and certainly Russia and Iran or North Korea, right? Like we've seen kind of some outreaches, certainly among those. Leland, let me put the same question to you. What's at stake if the relationship between the United States and China breaks down?
Well, a lot, but usually when people answer this, they talk about market volatility and all kinds of threats. There's a positive side to this too, because the United States has a lot of vulnerabilities to Chinese controlled supply chains going into the United States. And so, yes, there are all kinds of economic disruptions that are possible when you sort of pull these two countries apart from the incredibly interwoven manner that they've been operating it for decades. But at the same time, if you're the United States, you have to look at your supply chains and say, what do we not want Beijing to have leverage over us on? Critical minerals, pharmaceuticals, PPE, other things like that have a national security element to them. So, look, there's scary things when you talk about disrupting patterns of trade that have been the case for several decades. On the other hand, I think people are getting smarter on the idea that it doesn't make sense for a country to not look at this through a national security lens and to minimize the vulnerabilities they have to a country that could be its adversary in the future.
And I'm curious, in 2025, given the global supply chain and what we saw happen during COVID, and understanding what different countries are good at manufacturing, is it possible for the U.S. to decouple from China?
It's probably not possible, but let's just say there has been diversification due to a trade war 1.0 when those initial round of tariffs went on. That was on a much narrower band of goods, intermediate goods and the like, but it was enough to cause some businesses to have a look around and move their production. There was that. There was COVID. The pandemic absolutely rattled supply chains and opened a lot of manufacturing executives' eyes, so there's been diversification there as a result of that. But in terms of bigger picture, can all of that production come back to, say, the US, for example? Well, no, it can't, because it's much more expensive here. Labor is more expensive. There are more regulations. It's a very different story in terms of trying to set up manufacturing here. The other point is there are a few other places on the planet that offer the scale that China offers. I mean, there's always talk about alternatives, maybe India, but China has the infrastructure and scale in place, and that's why it remains so attractive for manufacturing bases.
Yeah, I'm increasingly, as I pick up things, seeing things that are made out of in India. Hey, Leland, just got about 30, 40 seconds. In a sign that deal is maybe front of mind, President Trump wrote on his Truth Social platforms hour before the U.S. tariffs against China took effect that there was great interest in TikTok. Adding a deal would be wonderful for China. On some level, is this a sign that all of this is just jockeying by the president for a win, as some have suggested? And forgive me, just about 30 seconds.
Again, this is all about sequencing. So if we're talking about taking care of fentanyl, getting a deal for TikTok, other things like that, which are forefront of the president's mind, sure, you can get to a deal on all these things if Beijing is willing. Talking about the structural imbalances in the relationship, that's a bigger deal. That will require probably bigger tariffs and a lot more tension. So look, can you get to the first step of this? Sure. Can you get to the next step of this? It's a lot longer road.
Listen, both of you, thank you so much. Leland Miller, the CEO of China Beige Book International, Bloomberg News, global economy reporter, and a current, both coming to us from D.C.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Business Week podcast. Catch us live weekday afternoons from 2 to 5 p.m. Eastern. Listen on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app, or watch us live on YouTube.
Now let's get to two well-known tech companies, both with government contracts and with tech billionaires connected to each. We're talking about Palantir and Tesla. Palantir shares, they are soaring to a record intraday after the Peter Thiel co-founded company gave a full-year revenue forecast that exceeded analyst estimates, driven by, quote, untamed organic growth and demand for its AI software. And then there's Tesla and its CEO Elon Musk and his Doge team's seeming takeover of the U.S. government. We're following both of these stories. On Tesla and Elon, President Trump pointing out some parameters just yesterday.
Elon can't do and won't do anything without our approval, and we'll give him the approval where appropriate. If there's a conflict, that we won't let him get near it. But he does have a good natural instinct. He's got a team of very talented people. We're trying to shrink government, and he can probably shrink it as well as anybody else, if not better.
All right, that, of course, is President Trump yesterday in the Oval Office. There's a lot going on, and just kind of some interesting play around these two companies. Let's get to it with Max Chafkin, Bloomberg Businessweek columnist, co-host of the Elon Inc. podcast, author of The Contrarian, Peter Thiel, and Silicon Valley's Pursuit of Power. He's here in studio. And then out there in Denver is Kurt Wagner, Bloomberg News technology reporter. He's author of Battle for the Bird, Jack Dorsey, Elon Musk, and the $44 billion fight for Twitter's soul. So perfect to talk to. I want to start with you, Max. Some earnings business, just to get it out of the way, but Palantir soaring to a record intraday, up more than 22% after reporting last night. What is it about this business, and why are investors so enthusiastic?
So two things. One is AI. This is a company that has sort of made its embrace of AI sort of central to how it talks about what it does. This is a company that makes software that helps governments and big companies organize data. So part of it is that this general sense that big companies and the government are going for AI. And the second part is related to the other thing you mentioned, which is Elon Musk, Donald Trump, this sense that the Trump administration is likely to embrace things like Palantir. I think both because you have Doge and you have Elon Musk saying we need to make things more efficient. Palantir has a value proposition there, but also, of course, there is a political connection. You know, Palantir, co-founded by Peter Thiel. Peter Thiel, still a major shareholder in this company. They are going to have, you would think, at least some kind of inside lane in terms of trying to get additional contracts, both because of the relationships with the Thiel network, because of their AI stuff, and because of Thiel himself.
Okay, speaking of government contractors, Palantir is a government contractor. So too is SpaceX. SpaceX founder, Tesla, the guy who built Tesla, we can fair to say, Elon Musk, they have or had relationships with President Trump. So that's where we want to go, and we want to bring in Kurt Wagner. What do we know about all that Elon and his team of engineers and others linked to his own company, and the Doge team, what exactly they're doing, at what parts of the U.S. government, what they're asking, and what they're trying to accomplish?
Oh, man. I mean, that's a lot. But I think generally, what you can assume is that Elon and his team are taking a bit of a forceful approach, right? I mean, we saw stories come out over the weekend and yesterday about them, essentially bullying their way into having full access to the Treasury Department's payment system. We saw them, single-handedly close USAID, right? Like this idea that they could go in and just sort of say, hey, this agency, this federal agency, we don't think they're doing a good job, and we're just going to, shut them down right then and there. And we hear these sort of horror stories come out from employees of these, different agencies who are saying, hey, we're trying to maybe stop this group of people. We're trying to make sure that they have appropriate access levels to read this classified information. And essentially, they're just forcing their way through. And so what I wrote about this morning in our tech newsletter was just sort of the parallels between what we're seeing there and what we saw with the Twitter takeover, right? Which was obviously a very brute force effort as well. Elon shows up, he brings his crew of people who are loyal to him and sort of just fan out and start causing chaos and wreaking havoc. And I think we're seeing that now, but on a government scale, which is obviously a very different and I think a bit of a scarier situation for people.
Max, I want to bring you in. I mean, in terms of when you guys talk about, Elon on the podcast and just, the coverage that you have done, that on one hand, I think Elon's probably like, this is a pretty cool task. Like, oh my God, I want to fix this, right? And on the other hand, I'm like, wait a minute, he's got to be like, look at what I have access to. Like, what do you think is his goal? What is, he learning or wanting to learn in this process? Is it altruistic or is it?
Well, I think you have a swirl. It's probably both, right?
Okay.
Both a sense of altruism and a profit motivation. And I think for someone like Elon Musk, those two things are tangled up. Elon Musk, he believes, and I think this is a genuine belief, not a cynical belief put on to make money, but he believes that yes, humanity needs to get to Mars. We should spend tens of billions of dollars, as a country on a Mars mission, and that Elon Musk, having the market-leading rocket, should get a large chunk of that money. Now, of course, that raises some significant questions in terms of conflict of interest. And I'd say, in addition to being a guy who's very motivated by these kind of big picture things, he is also a guy who tends not to pause much for concerns about conflict of interest, right? He's a shoot from the hip guy, and that's kind of what we're seeing in some of these incidents over the past couple of weeks that Kurt's talking about. This actual almost a physical confrontation between Musk's sort of representatives at Doge going into USAID and attempting to get access to these classified documents, and you had USAID personnel trying to stop them, and so yeah, it's chaotic, and I think there are real questions about sort of legality and whether or not any of this stuff he's doing is actually legal, and also, of course, these conflict of interest rules, because even with USAID, Starlink has taken money from USAID. So if he is quote unquote, shutting down USAID, which I don't think we really know that has happened, although he has said it, will those Starlink contracts go away? I mean, right. and so there are going to be a lot of questions like that.
Kurt, one thing that's unique about this situation, and it's not it's certainly there are a lot of parallels, as you write about, between what happened at Tesla and what's happening right now with Doge. He does report to the president ultimately in this. And I'm wondering if that changes things at all for the Elon Musk playbook. He's certainly used to being boss, but as we heard from the president yesterday, what did he say exactly? He said that Elon can't do and won't do anything without our approval, and will give approval where appropriate. If there's a conflict, we won't let him anywhere near it. That's part of what he said in the Oval Office yesterday. What do you make of it?
I mean, it feels like we haven't seen him slow down at all to this point, right? I presume perhaps behind the scenes he's saying, hey, I really want to cut this thing. And President Trump is saying, no, don't touch that. I don't really see that maybe playing out in that way, right? It feels like Trump has certainly given him a wide berth or to go out and do this thing and to do it in the way that he thinks he should. I think the point that I was trying to make earlier in the tech column was that, with Twitter, that was a private company that was purchased with private money, right? Like if he wants to sort of run that thing aggressively, run it into the ground in certain cases and deal with the consequences, that's his choice. The issue here is that all these decisions he is making and making them at an incredibly fast speed have an impact on, every U.S. citizen, including nobody who voted for him because he wasn't voted. He wasn't elected to this role, right? And so I think the distinction there is like, okay, private business, private ownership versus public funds, public impact. And that's, I think, the big thing that we need to keep in mind.
Yeah, absolutely. Totally agree with Kurt. And I think in where you're seeing real opposition is not from Donald Trump. I mean, it really seems like Donald Trump and Elon Musk are aligned at the moment. Musk had a Twitter Spaces and X Spaces over the weekend, and he said, I asked Trump if it was okay if to shut down USAID, and he said yes. And then I asked him again, and he said yes. Really emphasizing that Trump is on board. We have seen a few members of Congress, including Republican members of Congress, raise questions about, for instance, PEPFAR, which is this program, HIV medication program that has broad support, and Republicans raising questions about cutting that funding off. Of course, Democrats very spun up. I think, like to Kurt's point about Musk and the government having more shareholders than Elon Musk. The shareholders are the voters. That's where we're going to that's where the rubber's going to meet the road, when we start seeing congressional opposition, because a lot of this stuff can't be done legally without an act of Congress.
Max, well, go ahead, Carol.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say there are a lot of supporters of what Musk is doing. Look no further than just logging into the For You page on Twitter, and you'll see it there.
Right.
Cynics might say this is a guy with, you talked about the Mars connection. There's also the Tesla self-driving car legislation connection. There's perhaps the XAI connection if they end up using AI tech. There's the X payments connection if they want to bring in payments technology. I mean, what are some other potential conflicts of interest you see here? Yeah,
I mean, it's conflicts of interest all the way up and down. I mean, Musk, one of the reasons he's been effective, I'd say, over the last couple of weeks, if you could give him credit for, making a lot of noise, getting some stuff done, has been that he has a lot of experience with government. So besides the ones you mentioned, Neuralink is going to need FDA approval. That's Musk's brain implant if it wants to go beyond the kind of testing phase. You also have the Boring Company, right? That's a infrastructure play that is going to live or die on federal contracts. Even Tesla, you mentioned self-driving cars, but of course Tesla makes a ton of money, and much of its profit in any given quarter comes from these regulatory credits. So really, like, Musk is a master at working the levers of government. And he's trying a playbook that is relatively untested, I'd say, but does come from maybe, 20 years or so of experience of trying to bend the levers of power to his will.
Hey, Kurt, just got about 25 seconds here. How confident do we, or how much do we really know is going on? So in other words, the information flow of what Elon's doing, sleeping on the floor or not, or whatever, like how much do we really know? And forgive me, just about 25 seconds.
No, I think it's similar to all of his companies, right? Which is that he's surrounded by people who are very loyal to him, who believe that he's in the right and probably trying to protect him. So what you do hear is from those people who are willing to stick their neck out or raise their hand and say, what I'm seeing, doesn't sit well with me. And that includes government employees right now.
All right, guys, thank you so much. More to come, no doubt, on this issue in the days and weeks to come. Max Shafkin, columnist at Bloomberg Businessweek. Kurt Wagner, tech reporter here at Bloomberg News.
This is the Bloomberg Business Week podcast. Listen live each weekday starting at 2 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Kash Patel, President Trump's pick to lead the FBI, received a stock award last week from Truth Social's parent company worth more than $800,000. The grant of restricted shares in Trump Media and Technology Group did not, though, appear on Patel's financial disclosure or ethics agreement, which details how federal appointees will handle potential conflicts of interest.
So with what else we need to know on this and how much of a conflict this could actually be, we turn to Bloomberg News wealth reporter Annie Massa, who joins us here in our Bloomberg Business Week studio. Annie, you and the team have a great piece out about what exactly was awarded and when. So let's just start there. What do we know?
Yeah, so kind of stepping back, what's going on right now as Trump's nominees are going through their Senate confirmation hearings, they're putting out disclosure forms that give a full kind of financial picture of what they own, the assets that they have, what they own, and a plan for what they intend to keep, divest, And it all goes through this Office of Government Ethics. So Kash Patel is, of course, going through the confirmation process. And something that happened last week that we took note of was some corporate filings came out from Trump Media and Technology Group, which is the platform or the parent company of Truth Social, where Mr. Patel is on the board. And he, along with other board members, were given awards of restricted stock. So these awards, the timing is interesting, and these awards do not show up on that ethics disclosure, which some ethics experts who I spoke to said kind of raise some cause for question of what he would actually do with those restricted shares.
So what does Kash Patel say? What does Trump Media say?
So Trump Media, so we did not receive a response for the story. But I mean, it's true that companies award shares to board members. The timing is notable because the company is giving these shares out just as, actually, it was both Kash Patel and Linda McMahon, who's up for Department of Education Secretary. They both received these kind of restricted stock awards. And so if you step back, it's an interesting time for that to happen because the company presumably does know that these two people are leaving to go be in government positions. So it's an interesting time to give those awards, and they will vest over a period through 2027.
What are the rules when it comes to these, not just the financial disclosures, but what people who get confirmed in positions such as this have to do with assets once they are confirmed?
So this is the process that all of these nominees are going through. There's a plan in place, and it's disclosed. It's disclosed to senators. It's disclosed to the public so that there's accountability, and so that the idea is to go through all of their financials, see what they own, see where potential conflicts might arise, and come up with some plan that then the OG has approved and seen, this government ethics body, and put out there for for what they would have to divest, what they would keep, and it's a plan that everyone can see. And so what's notable here is there's no plan outlined. Mr. Patel said he would step down from his board position, but there's no specific plan outlined that you can see on what would happen to those very recently granted shares. And I mean, it bears mentioning that the value of those restricted shares last week was over $800,000. So it's not a small sum.
You also note in the story that his disclosures revealed another potential conflict of interest, and that is a stake of worth at least $1 million in the parent company of fast fashion brand Shein, which we know face some legal challenges here in the United States and some back and forth. Do they have to disclose, and do they have to divest?
That's one where there's a plan in place in the disclosures that he has. They report these in ranges, so between $1 million and $5 million of restricted shares in that parent company. And there's more of a plan laid out there. He said in the disclosures that the matters involved with this parent company could come across his desk at the FBI, but he would be recused from them. And so there's more of a plan that we can see there. But it was a big asset that was disclosed.
It's interesting seeing the assets that he has and also the business income that he's made. What about consulting?
And consulting work is absolutely part of this as well. And, you know, that's part of his relationship to, for example, Trump Media, which is, I mean, one other thing that bears mentioning with that relationship and being on the board of that company is, you know, Trump is the majority. I feel like it bears mentioning that Trump is the majority shareholder of Trump Media.
It's different from other holdings.
Right. Like, I mean, it's important to keep that in mind. So in conversations about what does this all mean, what kept coming up with the professors and experts that I spoke to was, you know, what does it mean to have that company with that ownership structure? Trump has those shares in a trust that's overseen by his son. You know, what does that mean to have an FBI director who could perhaps be owed stock? Like, what will happen to those share units? It was an open question on some people's minds.
And I guess what I was asking, like, I wanted a reminder of the rules. They have to disclose, or do they have to disclose? And do they have to ultimately divest or put it in a blind trust or something? Like, I don't remember. What are the rules?
The rules, it's kind of it's a bit of a case by case for different nominees. Every nominee has a different financial picture, but if a conflict of interest is determined to be there are options. They can divest, or sometimes they can hold on to restricted stock units. There's not just like one path for one type of asset. There's a review process that happens, and that's what all these nominees are going through. And the point is to get everyone on the same page with a set of facts about this. This is what I own. This is what I'm going to do with it.
Right.
And these are the potential conflicts and how they might arise.
We just had a long conversation with Max Chafkin and Kurt Wagner about Elon Musk and the different conflicts of interest that Elon Musk might have, or appearance of conflict of interest, I should say, given what his role is at Doge. Are we just in this kind of new era where these things are acceptable and no longer looked at as actual conflicts? It's just the way it goes when you hire people who have backgrounds such as these?
I mean, it's not new to have people coming into government roles who have some kind of business ties. Of course, that's happened before, but what's unprecedented here is something like Trump having, a majority stake in a publicly traded firm. There are people who are, coming into his administration, presumably, who have had financial ties to that firm. I mean, these are the questions that are completely new in the Trump 2.0 era.
Yeah, it would be like, I'm trying to think about, Jack Welch being president of the United States and somebody from his board being his, secretary of whatever. Like, if you just pick your CEO, like, you do wonder, like, that's just seems.
Well, Devin Nunes, who runs
rough.
Truth Social, left Congress and went and, ran Truth Social.
Right.
Like, there's this.
No, there's always this back and forth, but you do wonder about someone who's a key member of an administration, right? And then having a lot of exposure to the company that is owned by the president of the United States.
Exactly. So that's where you get into territory where it's really something different, really something beyond Wall Street, DC corridor.
And potentially not your typical conflict of interest. It's just interesting, right, as we try to make our way through and understand. Annie, thank you. Really appreciate it. Bloomberg News wealth reporter Annie Massar.
This is the Bloomberg Business Week podcast. Available on Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. Listen live weekday afternoons from 2 to 5 p.m. Eastern on Bloomberg.com, the iHeartRadio app, TuneIn, and the Bloomberg Business app. You can also watch us live every weekday on YouTube and always on the Bloomberg Terminal.